yet, whilst both sides of politics are arguing over important issues like whether Tony Abbott respects women or not, both sides of politics are doing a very good job of showing that generally they don't respect people. I mean, we have Tony Abbott, who doesn't have a lot of respect for people who come from that ugly place called overseas, particularly if they arrive by boat. And Julia Gillard, well, she obviously respects women, unless, of course, they are women who want to marry other women, or provided they don't get themselves banged up without a husband. Or they find that, they've married a man who's decided it's all too hard and wandered off into the twilight, leaving her holding a baby or two. What I'm talking about, of course, is this bill that passed through the Senate this week to cut welfare to single mums. Now, half of all divorces involve children. About a quarter of families with children under 15 are one-parent families, a quarter of them. Now, I'm guessing, I haven't got any statistics to back this up, but I'm going to take a wild stab in the dark and guess that most of those single-parent families are women, single mums. So, what does society do about single mums? It's a good question, isn't it? I mean, do we force them out to work, or do we pay their upkeep so that they can bring up their children in a loving environment? Well, of course, the answer is we send them out to work. We cut their allowance. We force them into employment, or get them to work more than they have been. So presumably these kids are going to have to harden up. They're going to have to learn to grow up with no parental love whatsoever, or less, because there's going to be less time for it. So what happens then? Do they become problem children that fall onto the wrong side of the law, which of course then creates problems down the track? It pushes up the cost of maintaining law and order. Not that that's a concern, because, there'll be a different government and it's down the track. But all this, of course, assumes the single mums can get a job. Jobs that are going to accommodate schedules for breastfeeding and the like. I'm assuming that the drive-thru at McDonald's don't allow their staff to do that sort of thing on the shop floor, so they take their orders for milkshakes. So this is a bill that is very bad news for single mums. I mean, on the one, it's heartening, isn't it, on the one side to see Labour and the coalition actually united on something at long last. But wouldn't it actually be nice to see them united on something positive? Instead, they're united on showing how callous they can both be, particularly considering this bill was passed despite the fact that a Senate inquiry is still underway on the subject. Well, there's no point in continuing with that now. The government has already decided. They've basically moved single parents from a parenting payment onto a New Start allowance, which for most single mums means a drop in income of between $60 and $100 a week. They'll basically have to get by on $38 a day. Why? Because we have this distorted view in Australia that a budget surplus should happen at all costs. Now, this move is going to save $700 million a year. That's about 0.2% of our total federal budget. Now, a much lower percentage, of course, if we start including all the state budgets as well, but 0.2%. That's how much we're saving. Now, I remember Wayne Swan described the last budget as a budget for battlers. I didn't realize what he meant by that was it's a budget to try and create more battlers. But that seems to be the approach. Now, New Start, that's what these single mums are on now. If you're single with a dependent child, it's $533 a fortnight. That's, as I said, $38 a day. Now, if you don't have kids, the New Start allowance is $35 a day. So the government has basically determined that the cost of bringing up a child, the difference, is $3 a day. And that someone with a child is just as likely to find work or be able to work as someone who doesn't have one. That's just a nonsense, isn't it? And it's all because we have this crazy notion that we need to balance the budget at all costs. Now, that might be fine over time, but, the importance of that is completely overstated, particularly in this country, where as a proportion of GDP, it's certainly nothing to worry about. And when the economy is struggling, like we're told it is, supposedly, and it is in certain sections of the economy, well, then surely that is the time for the government to prop up spending and protect society from the impacts of the ravages of the economy. But the way we do it instead, if we need to balance the budget, is to cut where people are going to feel it the most, rather than, surely the answer is to tax the rich, not take money away from those sections of society who are struggling the most. And This clearly isn't a political point. It can't be a political point because I'm talking about a Labour viewpoint in terms of cutting back on welfare for single mums. They're the ones who proposed this bill and voted for it. So it's not a political point, it's a compassionate point. Australia's egalitarian society is being quickly eroded. The average weekly income in Australia now is $1,350, but we reckon single mums can live on less than a fifth of that amount. And, you know, to point to the rising rich-poor gap, we can look at disparity in income levels, and I think you'd find that quite shocking. But the real measure, which is even more shocking, is the net worth. How much you earn and what assets you have. You know, things like that holiday house in the Byron Bay hinterland, for example. The wealthiest 20% of households in Australia account for 62% of the total household net worth, about $2.2 million per household. That's the wealthiest 20%. The poorest 20% account for 1% of net worth. So when it comes to deciding who we can get money from to help balance the budget, who do we choose? Do we choose that wealthiest 20%? No, we go for the poorest 20%. And incredibly, we still hear people describing Gillard's government as a socialist government. Socialism being seen, of course, as some sort of derogatory term akin to communism. I mean, let's get real here. There's not a shred of socialism or compassion in this government or in Australian politics anymore. Egalitarianism is what Australia once was, back in the 80s perhaps. But you know what helped with that egalitarianism in the 80s? We had a top tax rate of 60 cents for anyone earning more than $35,000 a year, and a tax-free threshold of around $5,000 a year. That's around $13,000 in today's money. Now, the tax threshold is half that amount in real terms, and the top rate of tax is down from 60 cents down to 45 cents in the dollar. So no wonder the rich are getting richer. They're not contributing as much to society, and their wealth, despite what economists try to argue, is not getting passed down. That's just not happening, which is why we're seeing this rising rich-poor gap. So the government has a duty to look after those who need the safety net. And this latest move is just a flagrant abuse of that trust, isn't it? Incidentally, the Joint Parliamentary Committee on Human Rights said that the New Start allowance, combined with other benefits, was not sufficient to provide an adequate standard of living, and they reckon it could be in violation of human rights under Article 9 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights. Now, this is Article 9, which is from the UN, a very short one, which says, "The states parties to the present covenant recognise the right of everyone to social security, including social insurance." So this is basically a requirement for membership to the United Nations. Now, we're spending a heap of money trying to get a seat on the United Nations Security Council for some peculiar reason, yet here we are flaunting membership requirements to the whole organisation.
Roger that.
Balls Radio.